Emma slid out of the bar and hit the sidewalk hard enough to taste cold on her tongue. Suspicion had been threading through her all night, the feeling someone followed her steps from the back alley to the cab stand, and it tightened as she tried to stand. Snow crusted into the cuff of her coat. Leila shouted from the doorway, "Emma, you okay?" A figure across the street paused under a hallowed lamppost and then melted into the darker line of buildings. The concrete stakes were simple and immediate. Someone had been tracking her tonight, and now she lay on the pavement with a fresh scrape, a missing purse, and a pair of eyes that had watched her fall. She pushed herself up on trembling hands. Her palms burned where they had struck the ground. Leila crouched beside her, breath fogging, hair unpinned and eyes wide. "You went white, Emma. You went pale." Leila's voice matched the night's urgency. Marco came out behind them, slap of his coat against the door frame, and he swore softly when he saw the scrape on Emma's palm. The manager's steps were decisive. He scanned the street and pointed, "Someone's been near the back door all night." "I told you to be careful." His voice carried a blunt, managerial worry. Emma frowned and tried to gather the facts. She could feel suspicion like a weight behind her breastbone. She searched her pockets with cold fingers. The wallet was gone, her breath hitched. The streetlights made everything look small and sharp. "My purse," she said. "My phone." Leila touched her arm. "There's a print on your sleeve," she said, brushing snow away to reveal a damp, gloved smudge, like someone grabbed you. Like they wanted your attention. Emma's jaw tightened. She blinked and forced a laugh that came out thin. "Then why didn't they take anything else?" she asked. Alexander Hale stepped forward from the shadow at the curb, as if he'd been walking through the night, and decided to intersect it. He was tall, coat buttoned against the cold, a neat scarf wrapped at the throat. He moved without the quick energy of panicked people. His steps were careful and precise. He reached down and lifted Emma into his arms. The action reversed the scene's balance. Where Emma had been vulnerable on the sidewalk, Alexander carried her away from watchful windows and toward a parked car that smelled faintly of leather and cedar. Leila let out a small sound. "Who are you?" she demanded. "I am Alexander," he said, and the name landed like a fact. He knelt and set Emma gently onto the back seat, then crouched beside her, scanning the street for movement. He touched the scrape on her palm with gloved fingers, his hand steady. "You have a cut. Did someone grab you?" he asked. His voice was low and even. Emma tried to answer and the words came out in fragments. "I thought someone bumped me. I closed early. I didn't see anyone follow me." The first emotion shift arrived in the way her chest changed from suspicion to a small, sharp relief when Alexander moved protectively. She let her shoulders drop as if gravity had permission now. Marco hovered, then handed Alexander the keys to his car without asking. "You don't look like a cop, but if you can drive her somewhere safe, do it." Marco's worry turned into blunt direction. His pragmatism pushed the situation forward. Leila insisted on dialing Emma's contacts and called the bar's last rides, reading out the names of men who had come in that night. Each name that didn't match the shadow across the street increased the mystery. The group concluded the watcher had kept distance and had been careful not to engage directly. A photograph slipped into Emma's coat lining when she later checked her pockets. She had not found it while crawling across the curb. The small folded photo showed her leaving the bar earlier that evening. The paper held a corner of evidence that turned a random threat into a targeted one. Alexander started the engine. The car's heater put a warm smear against Emma's neck. The second emotion shift arrived quickly. Relief shifted to fear when Emma noticed the photo. She sat up and fumbled open the coat. "There's a photo in my lining," she said, voice thin. Alexander's fingers pinched the paper and pulled it free. He spread it on the console and showed her the image. It was a grainy shot of her walking away from the bar, her hair in a loose bun. Someone had been following her movements for hours. Alexander's face didn't change except for an intensity settling into his eyes. "Who else knew you closed early?" he asked. He did not sound accusatory. He sounded like someone cataloging danger. They drove to Alexander's building because the lobby cameras were supposed to be reliable, and because a car left on the curb felt safer than the cold street. The elevator hummed up. Thomas, the super, met them at the door. He had a cigarette stub between two fingers and a frown between his brows. He checked the lobby monitor and scowled. "The feed's dead," he said. "Been dead since earlier. People complained about prowlers today." Thomas' voice carried the habit of someone who'd seen the city and learned to read its small warnings. The dead camera removed a layer of safety. Emma's fear tightened again, moving from a personal violation to a practical realization. Whoever was watching her understood systems. They had cut the camera. Inside Alexander's hallway the light was warmer and the air smelled faintly of lemon, cleaning fluid and linen. Emma sat on the couch while Alexander checked the door and windows. He moved with a controlled, efficient rhythm that made Leila ask, "You live here?" His hand paused on the door handle. "I do," he said. "Stay until we figure this out." The offer was simple, not theatrical. Emma felt something shift within her, trust in the face of danger, yet she bristled at the idea of owing anyone. Her jaw worked. She wrapped her arms around herself in the coat Alexander had draped across her shoulders. The room was small but private, with a radiator ticking and a frosted window that blurred the city lights into warm bokeh. Emma found, when she reached into the coat's lining, a small metal hairpin jammed into a seam. It didn't belong to her. She held it between thumb and forefinger and felt the cold metal bite. Alexander saw it and frowned. "That maker sells custom pins near low, lit corners of the city," he said. "They sell a certain style to people who know they're being watched. That concrete detail tightened the suspicion into a pattern." The hairpin suggested more than chance. It suggested someone had marked her. The discovery moved the group's actions from immediate shock into planning. They heard a soft knock at the door just as Thomas announced he'd called the front desk and local patrol. The sound had an even cadence, a single deliberate beat that did not match the city's earlier scraping noises. Alexander moved in front of Emma. "Who is it?" he called. The voice that answered was muffled, and a syllable of a name slipped through. "Open up," the tone had a push to it. Marco moved to the door and peered through the peephole. On the other side, a shadow filled the hallway. Someone pushed and the latch rattled. The group tensed. The emotion shifted again. The night's fear became an active, physical threat. The intruder forced the door and lunged into the threshold. Alexander shoved him back with his shoulder and planted himself as a barrier between the man and Emma. The man was bigger than Alexander's first impression allowed, wild-eyed and smelling of wet concrete. He lashed out and Alexander grabbed his wrists and twisted, driving him back into the corridor. The scuffle was sharp and brief. Thomas moved to wedge himself between the intruder and the stairwell, shouting, "Get out of here!" Marco grabbed the intruder's coat and pulled him to the floor. The man spat a name, no, a half-sentence that didn't make sense, and then fled down the stairs when 3 building residents opened their doors. The climax was sudden, violent, and clearly the chapter's peak. A hand on Emma that hadn't yet connected, a man in the doorway, Alexander blocking the thrust. In the scuffle, Alexander's gloves came off, and his palms showed a smudge of dirt and a shallow scratch. Emma watched him move with a clarity she hadn't allowed before. She noticed the way he kept his breathing even, the way his mouth tightened when he barked Thomas's name. "Thomas, call the police now," he ordered. Thomas's voice echoed down the stairwell as he did so. Marco leaned close to Emma and inspected her coat pockets for missing items. "Your purse is definitely gone," he said. "I saw a man linger by the alley earlier. He about you." Each named voice grounded the event. Marco, Thomas, Leila, Alexander. The city outside the window remained oblivious, lights bright and indifferent. Emma's hands trembled. She touched her wrist where the purse strap had sat. Leila moved around and squeezed her fingers. "You can stay here tonight." Leila, looking at Alexander as if asking permission. Alexander nodded, then looked at Emma. "You can stay until morning," he said. His voice carried no obligation, only a steady offering. Emma swallowed. The offer was practical. It was also intimate. She had to decide quickly whether to accept protection and lose independence, or to insist on returning to a small apartment alone and risk another encounter. Her decision-making process was immediate and physical. She tested the muscles in her legs and found them shaky. Emma's answer came out of a pause. "Okay," she said. The word without a flourish, with the dryness of someone counting risk and choosing the safer number. The group exhaled. Thomas checked the stairwell again. The police would be late. City patrols moved with priorities. Alexander wrapped his wool coat tighter around Emma and brought an extra blanket from a nearby closet. He moved with the easy competence of someone used to arranging comfort for others. Leila busied herself with the kettle, putting it on to make tea. Marco called the bar to insist the night shift file an incident and to get the name of the man who had been asking about Emma. Action followed the scuffle. Calls, checks, lists of names, conversation moved in quick lines. "Emma, can you tell me who might want to follow you?" Marco, "No." "Emma, not anyone I know." "Not lately." Alexander put the hairpin on the coffee table and leaned back in a chair. "What about at the bar?" "Any trouble tonight?" he asked. Emma described the two men who lingered near the dartboard and the regular who tipped with coins. Leila filled in details. The man with the grey cap left right before close. He kept looking at the alley. The exchange was functional. It mapped out possible leads. The dialogue revealed facts faster than any monologue could. The group laid out a plan. Thomas would walk Emma up to her floor in the morning and change the lobby code. Marco would file a report and send a list of the night's patrons to the police. Leila insisted on staying until dawn. Alexander offered to lend his car keys for runs to the police station if needed. Each named character made choices that changed the story's direction. Alexander's decision to remain a steady presence held the room together. Emma, who had been guarded about accepting help, watched how other people acted instead of explaining herself. The shift was subtle but clear. Suspicion had turned into wary cooperation. Alexander sat with Emma on the couch while they waited for Thomas's call back. He brewed a small cup of coffee and handed it to her with a neutral expression. Emma wrapped both hands around the warm mug. The heat radiated through her coat and into her chest. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was small. "Don't thank me yet," Alexander replied with a faint, near imperceptible smile. They talked in short exchanges about practicalities. "Do you live far?" "Alexander, 2 blocks, she said. "Top floor." "I'll stay until morning," he repeated. His repetition was not theatrical. It was a confirmation. When the police finally came, they took statements in the lobby. Emma sat on a folding chair, fingers clenched around the mug, and recited what she remembered. The officers asked questions about times and places. Marco supplied the names of patrons. Leila paced, then stopped and described the exact path Emma had taken. Each external event provided another layer of evidence. One officer noted the dead camera on his report. Another took the folded photograph and placed it in the evidence folder. The act of paperwork made the night legal and real. The officers left with a promise to follow up. The promise felt like a thin thing, but it was something. Later, after the police left, Alexander checked the window locks and closed the blinds. He returned the hairpin to the palm of his hand and studied it. "This could be traced to a merchant," he said. "If we can find who bought the pin. We can find who wanted to watch you." Emma turned the pin over between her fingers. The metal was warm now from her touch. She noticed a tiny stamped mark she hadn't seen in the hallway at first. The observation shifted their suspicion into a possible lead, a concrete place to investigate. Leila wrote down the mark in a notebook. Marco made a face. "City corners have their own economies," he said. people trade things, not just money. The comment was blunt and grounded. Thomas peered down the hallway and announced he had cleared the stairwell. He had seen no sign of the intruder in the building since the scuffle. The apartment felt quieter after that. Emma moved to the radiator and draped her damp scarf over it. The small domestic action made the danger feel less epic and more immediate. A scarf warming on a radiator, a hairpin on a coffee table, a man blocking a doorway. Emma met Alexander's eyes across the kitchenette. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. He cocked his head. "You don't have to say anything," he answered. She smelled cedar and coffee on his coat. The room held ordinary details that mattered. The chapter closed on a final practical beat. Emma dressed a little more warmly and tucked the hairpin into a small envelope Alexander had found in a drawer. Marco locked down a list of potential witnesses. Thomas promised to keep an eye on the stairwell overnight. Leila curled up on the couch with a blanket and fell asleep in an instant. Alexander stood by the doorway until Emma nodded that she trusted the arrangement. She slid the coat tighter and settled on the couch. "I'll stay until morning," she said again, this time with the steadiness of someone who had chosen safety over a lonely return. Alexander shut the door behind him, and the hall light fell across the coffee table, catching the small metal pin. The last sound was the radiator's soft tick and the faint scrape of snow against the window, and the chapter ended with a decision made and a fragile plan in place. Alexander's gloved hands tightened around Emma's shoulders as he shouldered her weight through the bar door into the vestibule. Snow blew in with them. The brass handle left a cold ring on Emma's palm where she had grasped it. Shame rose in her like heat when she realized people were watching. Leila's shout, a thin cough from doorman Marcus, a cluster of faces at the doorway. But she kept her jaw set and tried to push up. The shame decided everything in those first seconds. She would refuse help if it meant bills, gossip, or pity. She pulled, rasping, and said, "I can stand. I'm fine." Emma's voice came out small. Alexander did not let go. He set her on a wooden bench in the vestibule and held the scarf at the back of her neck until she stopped swaying. The vestibule smelled of wet wool and salt. Somebody's damp umbrella dripped into a tray. Across from Emma, Leila hovered at the threshold, apron still streaked with spilled beer, rubbing her palms together. "Emma, you fell hard." "Leila, you should go to a hospital." She kept her voice practical, like a list of steps. "Do you need me to call?" "No hospital," Emma cut in. She reached for her bag and found the strap tangled. Her fingers trembled with effort. "I can medical bills. I have shifts tomorrow." She the reasons like rules, not excuses. Alexander's face remained calm. He sat on the edge of the bench a few feet away and set his coat carefully on the floor beside him. Emma noticed the way his shoes were polished, the neat line of his cuff showing under a wool sleeve. She noticed his voice when he spoke because it kept its balance. "She needs warmth first. Alexander, a taxi to the clinic is fine later, if necessary. Right now she needs to stop shivering." His words were measured. He Emma's name once, with a softness that did not ask permission. Leila stepped forward and spoke fast. "Alexander, it's not for you to decide. She could have a concussion. You can just take her." "I saw her fall," Alexander replied. "I watched from across the street. I followed because someone else had been trailing her earlier. I can take her to my place for an hour. If she refuses, I'll call a cab." He kept his eyes on Emma while he spoke. Emma's face flamed. The shame was not only about being carried. It was about the particular kind of exposure that comes when someone famous or important stands in your messy life. Doorman Marcus muttered behind the desk, and a neighbor in a heavy coat peered in from the sidewalk. Someone the man's name under their breath, the syllables polite with curiosity. Emma knew from tips that drifted back to the bar that Alexander Hale's face sometimes appeared on news screens. The idea of his name in the vestibule made her stomach flip. She tried to shake him off verbally. "I don't want to be a spectacle. I don't need you to fix everything, meh." She stopped, searching for his name on instinct. "Hale," he supplied. "Alexander Hale." He inclined his head like a gentle seal of identity, and then added, "Call me Alexander. Call me whatever helps you keep your dignity." He did not smirk. He kept his hands where she could see them. Leila touched Emma's wrist. "Emma, please. Let him take you next door. My couch is covered in bleach and beer now. I can tea." The conversation tightened Emma's chest. She felt cold and dizzy. Her pulse thudded loud in her ears. She kept thinking of the money owed and the second job waiting the next morning, of the landlord's last text. The shame pushed her toward resistance. But Alexander's offer removed the familiar options. He did not suggest a friend's couch or the emergency room first. He offered his apartment in a way that did not ask for thanks. That surprised her. "Okay," she said finally. The word wasn't whole. Leila opened her mouth, then sealed it. Marcus pushed up from behind the desk and held the vestibule door for them while the sidewalk wind threw snow across the entry. The ride to Alexander's building felt too short and too long at once. Emma sat half curled on the passenger seat, her coat damp, a faint salt line at the cuff. Alexander drove smoothly, hands steady on the wheel. He talked to her in simple sentences between the streetlights, telling her he had seen someone watching her from the alley earlier, that he kept an eye on that corner. He nothing about his office or the board. He mentioned a grey scarf and a doorman named Marcus by name, details that made her feel oddly less anonymous, and more like a real person he could list off. "Who was following me?" "Emma, once he parked by his building and cut the engine. I didn't see his face clearly. Dark coat, hood up. He drifted away when I crossed the street. Alexander, I thought he might come back." His short sentences left room for her to react. The elevator smelled faintly of citrus cleaner. Alexander pressed the buttons with 2 fingers. He did not crowd her. He stood back as if he had learned how to measure distance precisely. Emma kept her head down. She wrapped the thin silver necklace she always worried about under her shirt. Her hand shook when she tried to unfasten the leather strap of her watch. In the corridor on his floor, a neighbor returned from a late shift and saw them. The neighbor's footsteps stuttered. "Is that a stranger with her?" she asked, voice flat with suspicion. Emma began to step away into the snow. The panic rose, a rapid, hot tightening in her throat that tasted like metal. She moved for the stairwell, for the bright cold that had become familiar and honest. Alexander's hand came down once to block her path. It was firm but not rough. "Wait, you're shivering." "Please." He did not raise his voice, but he did not let her pass. "Let me go, Emma." The words were low. "Don't hold me like I'm fragile. I don't need. You need a blanket and a warm place to sit." Alexander answered, "I am not asking for payment. I'm asking you to stay where it's warm, so you can tell me if you need a hospital." His voice had the kind of steady cadence that ground the moment. Neighbor Anna tapped the doorknob and watched. Leila's fingers found Emma's arm and squeezed lightly. Marcus lingered behind the desk, his posture open. The neighbor's doubt, Marcus's silence, Leila's tug, each of those small actions weighed into Emma's choice. She made a decision that held both a small surrender and a test. She let Alexander lead her inside. He walked with his coat open so she could look at the lines he chose for himself. Wool coat, scarf folded just so, gloves that matched the watch band. He kept his distance, but he kept his hand within sight. On the couch in his living room, he spread a thick blanket. The apartment smelled faintly of cedar and coffee. Emma noticed a stack of newspapers on a low table, a half-full cup of cooling espresso, and a neat row of shoes by the door. Alexander sat opposite and waited while she wrapped the blanket around her knees. He reached into his coat and produced a small thermos with a paper cup. He poured slow, careful pours. "Drink this," he said. Emma accepted the cup. The liquid was warm and bitter. It made her eyes water in relief. She took a breath and let her shoulders drop a fraction. The shame did not leave, but it loosened its fingers. She sat forward and pulled the thin silver chain from beneath her collar. You were going to tell me you can handle it on your own tomorrow. Alexander. But you need rest now. He included no judgment. He watched her sip. The conversation turned sharp when Lila burst back into the room with an updated plan. He shouldn't to keep you here, Emma. He should at least take your number and we'll find you a cab. I can miss my closing shift, okay? Lila's speech was quick. She paced as she talked. Lila, sit down, Emma, because she wanted to stop the argument. Alexander, I'll go to the clinic tomorrow if I'm bad. I'm okay for now, her voice wobbled. Alexander raised a hand. You both are speaking fast. Lila, thank you for watching me take her. Emma, if you want, you can call someone now. I can stay in the next room. If you prefer privacy, say so. If you prefer a friend, say that he did not try to persuade. He offered options. Emma's mouth formed and unformed around words. The shame had shifted into a different feeling, guarded relief that scraped along with distrust. That was the first emotion shift, shame to guarded relief. She him quietly, no calls. Please, she did not want collars, or questions, or the gossip that might make its way back to the bar. Lila left eventually, promising to text if anything changed. She pressed a hand to Emma's arm once before stepping over the rug and out into the hallway. Marcus nodded at Alexander before he closed the vestibule. The three of them narrowed the circle of witness down to a few people who had started the night in different places and now met at a domestic crossroad. When the apartment door clicked shut and the hallway's sound damped, Emma allowed herself to look at Alexander properly for the first time. Up close, his eyes were a cool gray, blue that tracked motion like a camera. He had a small crease between his brows. He had a faint scar on his knuckle. She looked for any sign of mockery and found none. She looked for the point where his day ended and his night began and saw only a man who did not expect to be thanked. Why did you follow me? Emma, sharper now that the immediate danger felt remote, because someone looked at you wrong in an alley and kept following after you when you left the bar. Alexander. I didn't want that to keep happening. I could have called the police, but I thought a warm place would be faster. This without drama. Emma's breath left in a small exhale. She thought of the man in the alley, of the way his hood sat low, of how he had vanished when he saw light. The memory of him was a concrete flicker, not a metaphor, a patch of dark at the curb, a boot scuffing snow. She found herself thinking who he might be, just a drifter, a creep, someone who mistook her fatigue for vulnerability. The second emotional shift arrived when Alexander quietly, I don't want you to be embarrassed because people recognize me. His voice had a softness in the last word that made her look down. You don't have to explain anything to me. She said in a voice that meant both resist and gratitude. He did not press. He reached for a small first aid kit in a drawer and took out antiseptic wipes. He cleaned a grazed knuckle where Emma had hit the pavement. The motion was ordinary and precise. Press, wipe, press. She did not speak while he worked. She watched his hands instead and felt the oddness of being fixed by someone who usually sat at the other end of a boardroom table, not at a kitchen drawer. Alexander, she said, why help a stranger? He paused and chose his answer carefully. Because sometimes you're the only person who sees something that needs to be stopped. Because I don't want regret, the last two words as if they were simple ledger entries. Emma tested his words by asking something smaller and personal. Do you know my name, really? Or did you just see me fall? He smiled faintly. I know your name now. I didn't before tonight. I remembered it the moment you said it when I asked the doorman. He shifted his gaze away for a second and added, I thought you deserved a place to warm up without questions. The way he put it made her think of choices made that did not require repayment. She let her guard drop in small increments. She him between sips of coffee about the double shifts and the landlord's last message. She kept the sentences simple and factual. Alexander listened and asked one or two specific questions, no pity, only interest. His question patterns were crisp, where, when, who. That specificity made her feel safer. It was not flattery, it was attention. Outside, a car door slammed, a neighbor shouted to someone on the phone, and a dog barked twice in the night. Each external sound punctuated the room and kept the story from sliding into private rumination. Emma realized she had stopped thinking about being watched and started thinking about practical things. Tomorrow's shift, the rent, whether she could sleep on this couch without waking with a crick in her neck. The shift was practical, shame to guarded relief to practical planning. At one point Leila's text arrived with an embarrassed emoji and 3 words. "Are you okay? Stay put." Emma's thumb hovered over the screen. She typed back, I'm okay." At that moment the apartment door opened a crack and a neighbor's foot appeared. The neighbor's voice asked a quick question about noise. Emma felt panic edging again. She stood up too fast. Dizziness pricked behind her eyes. "Sit," Alexander sharply. It was the only raised note of his voice that night. He steadied her by the elbows and guided her back into a chair. The suddenness of his command and the firmness in his hands sent a flush of trust through her. The internal narrations that had argued against accepting help quieted for a moment. That was the third emotional shift. Relief softened into a fragile trust. They made a small plan. Alexander offered to call a doctor in the morning if she still felt off. He heard where he kept extra blankets. He would leave the kettle on low and sit 2 rooms away if she wanted solitude. Emma him not to stay up. She insisted he needed his rest. When she said that, he smiled and answered, I'll be out in the living room. If you need anything, call my name. He left the sentence open and undemanding. At 3 in the morning the apartment hallway sounded like a low river. Emma lay on the couch wrapped tight and stared at the ceiling and thought of how a single decision had moved her entire night. The choice to step outside, the fall, the person who followed, the man who carried her. She rehearsed each small step until fatigue flattened her. She slept with one hand curled around her phone and the other under the blanket. She woke once during the night to a faint noise, Alexander moving in the kitchen. She kept her eyes closed and listened to bowls clink, footsteps on rug, the soft hiss of the kettle being turned off. She did not see him come back to the couch. She heard him sit in the next room and breathe like someone holding a vigil but not sleeping. In the morning, when light slid under the curtain, Emma's first concrete thought was rent. Her second was a small aversion. How to leave a stranger's apartment without looking like she'd been rescued. She dressed quietly, packed her bag and found Alexander already dressed, and at the door with his coat on. "You can go now if you want," he said. "I'll walk you to the cab." The sentence was neutral but practical. Emma hesitated. There was a line of curiosity and judgment in the hallway staircase. She pulled the blanket back over her shoulders and said, "Thank you, Alexander." "I mean it." The phrase was awkward but honest. He nodded. "Call me if you need anything. I want to check on you without your permission." He kept his promise in tone as well as words. When Emma stepped into the bright, cold air outside his building, Leila was there with 2 cups of coffee and a look that said a whole lecture would be coming later. Doorman Marcus tipped his cap. Neighbor Anna gave her a brief thumbs up and hurried to work. Alexander stood a moment, watching Emma fold her scarf and slip the thin silver pendant back beneath her collar. He pushed his gloved hand into his pocket and then reached out with it, without thinking, as if to make sure she had her bag. Emma took the gesture and did not pull away. A city cab slid up. Emma climbed in, paid, and turned to wave. Alexander watched until the back of the taxi swallowed her figure. Then he walked away toward the glass towers where he belonged. Emma sat back against the leather seat and felt a tightness, not like shame now, but like a question pressed into her ribs. The chapter closed with no grand revelation, but with a clear, situational beat. As the taxi pulled away, Emma's phone buzzed on the seat with an unknown number. She reached for it and hesitated, thumb hovering over the green button. The night had asked her to decide 3 times. Whether to accept help whether to let someone close enough to clean her wound, and whether to stay a little longer in a warm apartment with a man she hardly knew. Each decision altered the next step, and each step left a trail of consequences she could already feel threading into the morning. She did not answer the unknown call right away. She watched the street slide by, the city as storefronts waking up, and the snow smear into grey slush. And then she tapped the screen to see who wanted to reach her at that odd hour. Emma bolted upright and reached for the door that wasn't there. A man in a dark coat shifted from the armchair and held up a gloved hand like he meant to stop her before she spoke. Pride kept her from asking his name. She pushed the blanket away and tried to stand while her vision skittered along the coffee table and landed on a set of unfamiliar magazines. The central problem was clear within that first breath. She had collapsed outside the bar and woken inside a stranger's apartment, and she had to decide whether to accept help or to leave on her own terms. She tested her wrist and found a small smear of dried blood under the skin where her hand had hit the pavement. She tasted metal on the back of her tongue, and the room smelled faintly of cedar and clean linen. Emma herself what she always told herself when things slid off the rails: get up, get home, keep the hours you need, keep your head down. She moved too quickly and the sofa tipped her, so she sat back and folded her hands over the scarf Alexander had draped across her knees. Her throat worked. She forced a smile that felt like clenching a jaw. Alexander rose and took the scarf from her hands, then laid it back more gently than she expected. "You should sit still," he said. His voice was low and measured. It carried no impatience. "Emma, you shivering." Emma stared at the name and then at him. He said her name as if he had practiced pronunciation against a glass wall. She kept her mouth shut. Pride kept her from saying thank you. Pride kept her from explaining how she'd been working 2 shifts and how the last cab left before the snow had even started falling properly. She forced herself to speak. "Why am I here, Emma?" Her voice came out in a dry, short line. "Who brought me?" Alexander folded his hands on his knees and glanced at the hallway. "You collapsed outside the bar." "Marcus me." Her eyes narrowed. The name Marcus landed like another question. Marcus was the assistant whose name she'd seen once in a news blurb. The man who managed schedules for a man whose face was in business profiles and not on subway benches. Emma's chest tightened. Pride turned toward suspicion. She bristled at the idea that a stranger had used his reach to move pieces in the city on her behalf. An external sound interrupted them. Keys at the door, then a softer, familiar voice calling, "Emma." Leila pushed into the foyer with her coat half unzipped and breath puffing like steam. Leila's hair had bits of flour from the kitchen, where she'd helped close the bar. She clutched a paper cup. "Emma!" Leila, checking Emma head to toe. "You idiot, where did you go?" "I nearly called everyone." Leila's hands hovered over Emma's shoulders, as if steadying a friend and also testing whether the night had been mean enough to break bones. Emma forced her legs under her and willed a calm that looked like mobility. "I stood up and the ground moved," she said. The line came out clipped and a little humorous, which was how she hid holes in her balance. Leila grabbed her hand and squeezed. "You're ridiculous, Leila. You could have frozen out there." Marcus's entrance changed the temperature in the room in a different way. He stood in the hallway, tablet tucked under his arm, and then hesitated when he saw Emma. Marcus's forehead creased. He was efficient, the kind of man who kept things like calendar invites and building access notes in neat columns. "I didn't mean to," Marcus began, then stopped because he saw how Emma watched him. Emma's suspicion sharpened into anger. She wanted to stand and tell Marcus that she didn't need favors from people perched in glass towers. Marcus, Alexander, and the single name address shifted the air. Marcus gave a small, automatic bow with his head. She collapsed in front of the bar entrance. "Marcus, the building manager, called me. I asked if anyone had a warm place." Marcus's voice was flat, almost clinical. Emma's pride folded inward like a closed letter. Someone had asked after her without her consent and used channels she could not touch. Emma stood up too quickly again and swayed. Alexander stepped forward and caught her elbow with steady hands. Leila pushed a paper cup of coffee toward Emma. "Drink, Leila." Blunt and practical, you shivering like an old radio. The coffee was hot and bitter. Emma swallowed and let the warmth travel down her spine. Shame flicked across her face when she realized the bar's regulars had probably watched her fall. Shame slid into anger when she imagined whispers. "I'm fine, Emma," but the word came out thin. Marcus glanced at Alexander and then at Leila. There was a private calculation in his eyes. "We should check whether you hit your head properly, Marcus." He lifted his tablet as if to record notes, but his movement looked like a test. He wanted confirmation that this incident would leave no trace that might later be spun. Emma bristled. "No, Marcus," she said. "I don't want anything recorded." Marcus's mouth thinned. "Hale authorized medical intake if necessary." The phrasing made the protection transactional. Emma felt a new shift, suspicion to indignation. She cut him off with a short laugh that was more a bark. "Does he always authorize medical intake for strangers on the sidewalk?" "Emma." Her voice made a small, dangerous arc. Alexander's eyes sharpened, but he kept his expression smooth. "I asked the building manager to check your apartment because I was worried." He did not use "because I saw you fall" as an explanation. He used worried, a softer, less claimable word. Emma's jaw clenched. The reveal that he had used private resources forced her to confront the imbalance between them. She had a worn leather crossbody bag and a thin silver necklace. He had a schedule, an assistant, and the power to move people. Leila put her hand flat against Emma's back. "Emma, look at me." "Leila, you didn't have to." Leila stopped because she saw Emma's face turn hard with pride, then crack with fatigue. "You don't have to explain to them, Leila, but you can't argue with the scarf either." Emma pulled the scarf tighter, and the fabric smelled faintly of cedar. She looked at Alexander as if trying to read a ledger. "Why did you do that?" she asked simply. Her tone contained a shift, anger to a brittle need for clarity. She watched him for any sign that he had calculated her presence as part of some personal game. Alexander set his hands on his knees and leaned forward in a controlled way. "Because you were an image in the doorway that I couldn't ignore." He kept his sentence spare. "Because I didn't want you outside in the snow." His admission removed the thin varnish of corporate policy and replaced it with a human cause. A small, private twist arrived. He had watched her collapse and then used influence to have her checked and sheltered. Emma's suspicion blinked into a different shape, curiosity mixed with guarded gratitude. Marcus cleared his throat. "Mr. Hale, we have a morning briefing in 30 minutes. He looked at Alexander for permission to leave. Marcus's role forced a quick decision that would send Alexander back into the public world. Alexander nodded to Marcus. "Do it, Alexander." Marcus stepped back and then lingered with the tablet as if waiting for direction about what to report. Marcus's lingering triggered another external event, the potential of exposure. Emma's face hardened. "So this goes on your schedule somewhere," she said. "It's not anonymous. I can keep it off the record if you prefer, Alexander." His offer was soft, but it implied leverage. Emma's hands tightened into fists in her lap. Pride turned toward defiance. She stood up with the intention of leaving, of walking out the front door and taking the snow back into her lungs rather than the risk of a story attached to her name. She stepped into the foyer and the cold air hit her face. The snow outside had blurred the street into soft lights and muted sounds. It made the city look less like a place that judged and more like a place that muffled. Emma's breath came out in short bursts. Leila wrapped her arm around Emma's waist and said, "Emma, you can't just go out there by yourself." "Not today." Leila's voice tightened. She tested whether Emma would make a practical choice. Emma pulled away from Leila's grip and walked to the stair. "I have rent to pay," she said. "I have shifts. I don't need people deciding for me." Her tone contained an emotional shift from wounded to defiant. Leila followed with quick steps. "You were not a thing to be arranged, Leila. You were my friend." At the stoop, Emma gripped the banister and felt the cold through the metal. She wrapped her scarf tighter and turned toward the street. Alexander followed and blocked her gently with the breadth of his coat. He did not reach for her. He placed himself at the edge of the doorway like a barrier. The motion was deliberate and not aggressive. It forced a pause. "Emma, Alexander." He kept his voice level, but there was an unguarded note in it. "I didn't bring you here because I wanted to control your morning. I came because—" He stopped and looked at his own hands, an odd, small human gesture, "because I can't ignore when someone is hurt on a sidewalk anymore." Emma opened her mouth and then shut it. Leila watched both of them with a protective glint. The confrontation shifted. Alexander's posture had been authoritative in earlier chapters. Here, he allowed a crack. The emotional peak approached as he risked something he rarely offered: vulnerability. "Why should I trust you, Alexander?" "Emma." The use of his name sharpened the ground between them. She spoke with short sentences. Leila's breath hitched at the question. Emma's pride argued for independence. Her hands raked through her hair. "You don't know me. You don't have to fix my life." Alexander's gaze did not move away. "I know enough," he said. "I know how the city looks from glass towers at night. And I know what it does to people who are left on the edge. I know what it feels like to be watched without being seen." He stopped, then added, quietly, "That's not a justification. It's a truth." Emma's next step was a quick, sharp burst. She stomped onto the stoop, and the snow shifted under her boots. She faced him fully. "You can't decide what someone needs just because you can arrange it," she said. Her voice was steady and short. "You can't buy dignity back with warm blankets and closed records." Alexander did not retreat. Instead, he took a breath and let it out slowly. "I don't want to buy anything," he said. "I want to offer something small and see if you accept it." His hands were open but still deliberate. He stepped closer until the light from the street lamp hallowed the edge of his coat. "I'm not your savior, Emma. I'm not offering a favor. I'm asking permission to be present for as long as you'll allow it." Leila's face softened. She stepped between them for a moment and looked at Emma. "Emma, you allowed to let someone help you without it meaning you owe them everything." "Leila." The exchange sparked a rapid back and forth that was almost an argument in miniature. "Leila, I don't want charity." "Emma, it's not charity," Leila replied. "It's interference." Emma shot back. "It's care, Leila. There's a difference." 3 quick lines, and the emotional energy tightened. Emma's hands trembled slightly. She felt a second shift, defiance to a fragile consideration. The small cliffhanger arrived when Alexander lifted his chin and said, "I'll tell you exactly why I checked on your apartment. Because I used to assume distance was the right thing to do, and then I saw what distance cost people." The sentence stopped and left the question of what he had lost hanging in the cold. Emma wanted to pry. She had a habit of pushing when people tried to soften edges. "What did distance cost you?" Her voice was low. The streetlight caught the silver at Alexander's temples. He looked away for a beat and then back with steadiness. "I had a relationship once I walked away from because my job felt safer than the person beside me." Alexander. He did not expand into a long story. He gave a concrete example, not a metaphor. "I left because I thought I protected myself. Then I realized I had protected myself from care." That specific admission changed how Emma understood his earlier actions. They were not gestures to prove power, but to remedy an earlier choice. Emma felt a change in the air between them, hardness softening into something brittle and tentative. She had been building walls for months. In the first chapters, she had slid out of the bar and hit the sidewalk, suspicion tracking her. Now the suspicion thinned into a question about whether someone who had learned from distance could actually offer help differently. She tested the boundary with a small, practical request. "If you were going to be involved, Then leave my name out of anything with Marcus, Emma, and don't make a spectacle of whatever you intend to do." Alexander nodded. He folded his hands. "I won't make a spectacle. Leave it to me and Marcus." He hesitated, then added, "I'll respect your privacy. I promise that much." The word promise was not extravagant. It was spare and measurable. Emma felt another internal shift, cautious suspicion to guarded acceptance. A new external event arrived. A neighbor from the stair called down, "Someone left a scarf on the radiator." The small announcement landed like an ordinary ripple that confirmed something real had happened. Alexander had left a scarf by the radiator as a physical token. Emma went back inside to check and found the scarf still there, folded over the metal with a faint crease. Leila brought a paper cup, and Marcus checked his tablet at the doorway like someone entering his operational role. Back inside the living room, the conversation steadied into small gestures. Alexander brewed tea in a methodical way and handed Emma a cup. She accepted, testing the warmth before she drank. Her hands trembled less now. The tea steadied them. Alexander cleaned a small graze on her knuckle with a damp cloth, and did it with care that was efficient but not clinical. Emma flinched only once when the cloth brushed the small scar at her left eyebrow. She kept her eyes down. They traded short, direct lines. "You should call your boss, Alexander. Tell them you re-injured." Emma shook her head. "I can't miss a shift, Alexander." She kept the name short and precise. Leila cut in. "You can miss the morning shift. I'll cover. Go home and sleep." Emma looked at Leila, then at Alexander. The room felt scaled to their three presences, Emma with her stubborn independence, Leila with her practical protectiveness, Alexander with his deliberate calm. The emotional pressure eased into a manageable space. Emma's choices shifted from absolute refusal to testing a small allowance. She would accept a scarf, a drink, a promise of privacy, but not a hand that rearranged her life. Later, when the sky had shifted to pale and the street lights melted into morning, Emma woke alone on the sofa with the scarf folded over the radiator and Leila asleep in the chair with a half-drunk cup at her side. Alexander's coat was gone from the hook, and his shoes were not in sight. On the small kitchen table lay a neatly folded card with his name printed in a plain type and a short line in his handwriting. "If you want, come by the cafe on 7th at 3. No pressure. Alexander. The card was a concrete offering, specific and time-bound. Emma sat up and ran her fingers over the folded paper. The passive sense of being chosen evaporated into the decision in front of her. Accept a meeting or not? She felt the last emotional shift, caution toward curiosity. She was not ready to hand over control, but she allowed herself to imagine a single cup of coffee without expectations. Leila woke and stretched, and Marcus's voice came down the hall asking whether Emma needed anything logged for the morning. Emma shook her head and folded the card into the slim pocket of her leather crossbody bag. The chapter concluded with a decisive, concrete beat. Alexander's footfalls returned to the door for a moment. He leaned in the doorway, fixed Emma with a steady look, and then set his hand on the knob. He did not make a grand proclamation. "I'll leave you to your morning." Then he closed the door with a soft click, was both physically heard and clearly decisive about boundaries. He had offered presence and then retreated to let Emma choose. The sound cut the room into before and after. Emma held the folded note and understood the choice she had to make, and she felt, for the first time that morning, the shape of a decision that belonged to her.